أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Welcome everyone to the second last RSR lecture. I know it's very sad, but inshallah it's been a beneficial journey for us all. And it is nearly also the end, so we're halfway through Ramadan, so we're nearly at the end of the holy period in our yearly calendar. So inshallah we've reaped as much of the benefits as we can from these months, and we still have Layali Qadr, so we still have a huge chance to catch up. We haven't done as much as we would have liked, but inshallah we're using Ramadan wisely, and our Layali Qadr are beneficial to us all. Today's topic is the ego. So now that we've finished the 4 steps to actualizing our divine intellectual soul, we are going to move on to the ego. Before we even start the lecture, we are going to read Dua al-Faraj as we always do before each lecture, so that we can inshallah have the blessing and the presence of the Imam of our time, Ajjallah Ta'ala Farajah Sharif. So if you can all read with me, that would be great. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل. So yeah, today's lecture is the ego, and you'll see why we've given the ego its own separate lecture. It sort of feels off tangent, but inshallah today we'll explain to you guys why the ego is so important and why it's so related to this lecture series. So if you remember, we talked about how the divine intellectual soul has 4 different factors that we need to accomplish so that we can actualize the soul. So we need the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the love of Ahlul Bayt, dhikr, and then hang out with the right people. And we've talked about that in the past 5 weeks. But the thing is, there is something that is a barrier to each of these things. And so pride is what is the biggest barrier to our love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if we see ourselves as something important, we won't, and we begin to love ourselves, that's what the ego is, we'll begin to not look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the person we have to love, and only Him. Envy. Envy is really what stops us from loving Ahlul Bayt, and we'll explain to you guys later why that's the case. What stops dhikr is our greed and our attachment to this world and the dunya. And finally, hate is what really blocks us being able to see the people around us as awliya, and to be able to be awliya for others as well. Our hatred is really what blocks us from having those inner circles that we need so we can reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So really, what is stopping us from actualizing our human soul, these traits, and all these traits actually come from the same place and stem from the same source, and that's the ego. So we can really see, we can really treat the ego as like the antinomy of the human soul, like the divine intellectual soul. So it's like the opposite, so what opposes it. That's our ego. So the question here is, if you remember when we talked about the divine intellectual soul, we said we have the fitra inside of us, and that's like a moral compass, and that compass points towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sirat al-mustaqim. So whenever we're lost, we have this intrinsic thing inside of us that drives us to the right path. It's a gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. The question we should ask is, then why is it so hard for us to, even actualize this divine intellectual soul? What's stopping us from getting there? Because if we've been given something that intrinsically points us towards it, surely it's sort of easy and everyone will be just, achieving this. And the answer is no, because we have something that opposes the fitrah directly, and something that wants us to like, you know, make us astray. And I say something, but it can also be, you know, someone or a group. It's the shaitan. The shaitan himself is what's opposing us. Because in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the shaitan's response. And what we said, what the shaitan says as well. So in Surah Al-Isra, ayah 61, 62, 63, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says as follows: وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ قَالَ أَأَسْجُدُ لِمَنْ خَلَقْتَ طِينًا قال أرأيتك هذا الذي كرمت علي لئن أخرتني إلى يوم القيامة لأحتنكن ذريته إلا قليلا قال اذهب فمن تبعك منهم فإن جهنم جزاؤكم جزاء موفورا. So in this surah, we see the biggest problem with the shaitan. He said, I'm not going to prostrate to Adam because he's made of mud and I'm made from fire. I am better than him. The problem with the shaitan himself was the ego. And that's why we can see how dangerous the ego is. Because it took the shaitan from the position of, like, with the angels to the lowest of beings that wants to make everyone else just as bad as he is. So it was his ego that didn't want him, and his pride, his arrogance. He didn't want to prostrate to someone he thought was weaker than him. But obviously he didn't realize the reality of who Adam was and the potential that Adam had. So his ego made him envious of Adam and how much praise he was getting. He was too proud to admit to Adam. He was also greedy. He wanted the best position for himself, and he hated Adam because he saw that Adam had something he didn't have. And therefore, we can see that the ego is the in Arabic we use the word محور. In English, so the centerpiece. It's like what all these other factors revolve around. It's the ego. But what's interesting is in the ayah 63, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really does say something really important. He says that anyone who follows you will get hellfire. So if we follow shaitan, it can mean that, you know, we'll listen to his wasawis or listen to his whispers that make us go astray. But it's also following what his issue, having the same issue as he did. We just talked about how his issue was the ego. And so if we let our ego drive us, we'll be following him, following his example. And therefore, we deserve hellfire. So inshallah, this ayah shows how bad the ego is and how important it is for us not to follow it, because it will block our ascension to who we're meant to be, the insan al-kamil. Alright, so yeah, tabi'aka, that's the key word, to follow. So the biggest issue is the ego. So if you remember in our example, we said how we are going on a trampoline with many different people, right? We said how the more people we have on the trampoline, the higher we can jump, because if you've been on a trampoline with others, you guys can, if you work together, collectively make yourselves jump higher. But at the same time, we said that if there are people on the trampoline that can't cooperate with you and jump with you at the same time, they can actually cancel out your progress. These are shayateen al-ins. So we all know about, you know, the shaitan and then the jinn that are with the shaitan. And we've got numerous times in the Quran we're told about there isn't just one shaitan. Iblis is a shaitan, yeah, but there are other shayateen. In Surah Mulk, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says how we've made the وَجَعَلْنَاهَا رُجُومًا لِلشَّيَاطِينَ, using a plural for shaitan. And so we can see that there are more, multiple shayateen. But the thing is, there aren't just jinn shayateen, there are people that can also be a shayateen. And these are more dangerous. Why? Because they could be between us and we don't see them. They're people that are also, like the shaitan, willing to pull us down. And so that's why last lecture we emphasized how important it is to keep our inner circles tight. Because if we let these people seep and infiltrate, they won't let us jump. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Sorry, it's just a bit of a technical issue with the laptop. Okay. Alright, it's working now. Awesome. So now, the next thing we should probably get into is what is the ego itself. We talked about how bad it is, how it's what led to the shaitan's downfall, and how we should definitely not follow this track, and so we shouldn't let it control us. But what even is the ego? You know, like the general definition that people usually associate with the ego is this whole concept of, oh, I think I'm, like, you, self-importance, like you think you're that good, you think you're the king over everyone else, and you're the most important thing ever. But sometimes we don't realize that even just thinking that we have a lot of self-worth and like appreciating ourselves, that can also be a form of ego and a way that we feed the ego. It's a more like subtle way, but it's also just as dangerous if left like, you know, out of control, because it can lead to the second form of ego that we all know. So this whole fact that I am on point, I am good, I am special, these notions can all lead to that ego that we should be avoiding. So the ego is the way we recognize ourselves in this world. So the ego is something of the dunya because it's related to the dunya. It's related to this, like, us thinking that we are the most important in this limited time that we have. And so that's just what, just something we have to clarify. So when we're looking at the ego, we should try sort of finding out where it sort of stems from. And the ego, it sort of stems from the animalistic soul. The thing is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wouldn't give us something. Like He gave us the desires, and when we talk about the animalistic soul lecture, we said the desires were important because they were needed for our survival. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have also given us, like, have a reason for giving us the ego. And He has. Just like our desires are important for survival, the ego is too. It's in charge of our ability to defend ourselves. We wouldn't defend our life if we didn't think our life was important, right? And so, by having that intrinsic drive that I am important, I want to survive, you're able to survive in this world. So, like, we can really see this. A good example of this is, why do adults work? They work because they know that they need to get money so they can support themselves and their families. This whole sense of I is present there. But I guess, as a starting point, that is important. But it shouldn't be the only reason we work. It should be also towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fulfill our duty in our families. But another example can be seen when a doctor prescribes you medication and you're sick. You can easily just not take the medication and die. But usually a lot of the time we take the medication because we want to get better. We don't want to have our life in this, our time in this world end. So it's really important for us to have this ego so that we don't prematurely, I guess, end our life, and unnecessarily. And so we do have the full time that we're given so that we can try actualizing ourselves. So the ego is somewhat important here. So the ego, like, where it becomes problematic is when we think that we're the center of our own universe. So when we have this, like, sort of mentality, back in the day, people thought the Earth was the center of the universe because they thought, like, you know, that they were so important. But now we realize the sun's the center of the universe. But really, if we make ourselves the center of the universe, that really becomes problematic because we make ourselves more important than we actually are, and so we become arrogant and we get those bad traits. Instead, we have to recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the actual center of the universe. Not physically, obviously, but metaphorically. He's what everything should be, is working around, and we should be working in that same rotation as well. We know that all of nature orbits around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, worships Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in its own way, and so we should also follow that track and that system. But as we said before, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obviously gave us the ego for a reason, and we said it was for survival. But it's also really important for a baby specifically. We can see why it's really important for survival if we look at a baby. So, you know, when a baby is born, they're quite helpless. They don't have, you know, they can't really do much by themselves. And so when they get hungry, they learn that a way to get what they need, which is the nutrients and the sustenance, is to cry. And obviously when a baby cries, so this is not when they're straight away born. It's when they're hungry, or when they're uncomfortable, or when they need a nappy change, for example. When a baby cries, what they're doing is they get attention, they build this sort of identity for themselves. If I cry, I will get service for myself, to satisfy my own needs. And so they begin to develop an ego. Because initially, what it does is it gives them a self-awareness. But what like this whole crying system does is it does prevent them from having an awareness of others. Because if I cry and I get what I need, I'm now aware that I have needs. but I'm not aware that it's people also have needs, other people. All I see is other people can satisfy my needs. And so you get that sort of like egotistical thinking. Yeah, so we lose that awareness of others. And that's why when children are growing up, it's really important to teach them these lessons, like to share, take turns, to thank people, because that slowly allows them, to get rid of or like overcome the ego as a centerpiece of their life. So it's important at the beginning. We need it to be able to overcome it. An example of this is when we use leeches in the medical field. We initially need them to suck away the blood, to stimulate blood flow. We need it to, like for wound healing. A lot of the time they used to use it back in the day. But we can't keep it there because it will continuously suck our blood eventually, draining, making us sicker than we used to be. And so what we need to is have this leech at the beginning, but then remove it once we don't need it anymore. Similarly, when we reach the age of velour, so when we become baligh, and we set off for our own journey, we have our own fleet, we no longer need the ego. And so it's important for us to, by this point, have crushed the ego, or work to crushing the ego. And so that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave us desires a lot of the time to overcome them. He gave us anger to overcome anger. He also gave us the ego to overcome the ego. It's part of the system He created, part of the test. And so we should recognize that it is important for a child to have this sense of self-importance as well, because they need to realize why they are important as the best creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They need to realize that, they are, because if someone is just continuously doesn't think about their own needs and their own development towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they can lose their way theoretically, because they won't actually work on bettering themselves, because they won't see themselves as a starting point. So it's important for children to have that ego, but then it's also important for us to overcome it later on. So that's a concept we'll introduce. Or else, they'll fall into depression, they won't even improve. We said that if we only look at the past and get stuck in the past, we won't improve. So we can have that same principle apply here. We need to have the ego so we can break free from it. Alright, so now we'll look at each of the 4 different qualities that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture, which were pride, hate, envy, and greed. And we're going to talk about how these specifically halt one of the 4 steps of actualization of the divine intellectual soul, and then how we can overcome them. So the first one was pride. And so pride really can be characterized as the following. And we can really see it as loving ourselves or giving ourselves more importance than everything around us, and specifically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can see this a lot of the time with some people who, they pick and choose their religion. By that we mean people that let's say, oh, I'm Muslim, I like this and that of Islam, but I know what's best, and so I don't think that those bits are for me. By doing that, we've given ourselves more importance than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who created the system. We're saying that some of the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just aren't for us, The system He created for human beings just isn't for me. By doing that, we're showing a level of pride. Pride's problem is that we give ourselves a place in our heart where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be. Remember how we said we have to have a qalb salim, or a safeguarded heart? A heart where everything is in the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Unfortunately, what we can do is we can love ourselves and give ourselves that back in our hearts. And why that's problematic is from that area, we can start developing love for other stuff. Like, love for food stems from a love for what you want, and therefore yourself. A love for specific characters, or love, to be, all those, specific traits can stem from your own ego and your own pride. So that's what pride is. And so pride really does stem into shirk al-qalbi. It's really the essence of shirk al-qalbi. Because a lot of the time, when we put equal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that equal is us. We, a lot of the time, when we think of polytheism, we think of all those people, that believe in other idols and things like that, and other gods. But it can also be ourselves, and that's why atheists theoretically also are polytheists. Have this are mushrikeen, because they have associated themselves as an equal, if not a replacement, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their hearts. So a great example to look at a people who were so driven by pride that it led them astray and led them away from the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the people of Ad, or Qawm Ad. So their story is they were given so many blessings. They used to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were given so many blessings in this dunya and so much power and wealth and things like that. And part of their rituals, to bury the dead, they used to create these beautiful graves and statues of the people that died. And what happened was eventually, because they were so self-driven and loved themselves so much and their forefathers, they began not only to worship the attributes of their forefathers, eventually making them in a statue-like form, because they had their forefathers in statue-like forms already. And so eventually they turned the traits that they loved about themselves into those idols that they worshipped. So theoretically, they were so proud that they put themselves as an equal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They thought they were invincible, and that's why they began worshipping these statues. So pretty much, if you want more context about this, their statues or their gods, if you actually find out what they actually are, you can see that they're all just traits. They're the waterer, the peaceful, the giver, the protector. They're the things that they liked about themselves, but they've personified them as gods. And so in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about Qawm Ad. He says, فَأَمَّا عَادْ فَاسْتَكْبَرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. That's the bit we want to highlight in this ayah. The word is takbaru, and in English it means they were arrogant, they were proud, they saw themselves as too great a force, and that's why they did the shirk in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so hopefully that shows you why pride is such a bad thing. It means that we can, give ourselves more importance. And so a really good modern day example of pride is addiction. Whenever we're addicted to something, we're giving it a place in our hearts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't, make yourself happy. That's a notion that comes about all the time. And it's if we're so self-indulgent in our ego and our pride in ourselves that we give ourselves importance in our own time. This whole notion means that we can have shirk in our heart, because we can love ourselves and not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so if we continuously have this shirk al-qalbi, it can eventually become shirk al-amali. Addiction is the consequence of having this initial shirk, because once you've identified that there is something that can have a place other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your heart, you now allow that entry or that back door for other things to take up your time, take up more than that quarter of your time, and therefore become an addiction. And so eventually, it can, even games, something that's so small that we see as a routine part of our lives, can actually be shirk al-amali. And we can really see something as an addiction if it does become a routine. So let's say if you wake up every day, 7 o'clock in the morning, and you have to have an hour of gaming time, that's bad. You've made it a routine, and therefore that's proven that it's an addiction. And so to avoid it, pretty much, to avoid pride and to overcome that whole factor of pride, try getting rid of anything you see that you're addicted to. Change up what's going on in your routine so that you're not addicted to one thing and giving it too big of a place in your heart. Eventually what that'll do, it will dwindle down the shuraka or the equals that you have in your heart other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and eventually you'll realize that the only thing left is your ego or yourself, and you also put that away, put that aside. Next up is envy. So envy can be characterized really easily as seeing an attribute in someone else that's really good, and you recognize that it's good, but you become jealous. You become jealous that they have and you don't. And so you begin to isolate or dissociate from that person because you're jealous of them. That's really what envy is. And we give the example of Scar here because that's what happened in The Lion King. He wanted the throne, and he was envious of Simba, who was the child that was going to succeed the throne, and so he does everything and destroys his entire childhood just so that he can take the throne. He was envious, and his envy drove him to kill his brother and then usurp the throne. So the problem, we have envy as the antinomy of loving Ahlul Bayt. And why that's the case is because a lot of the time people see Ahlul Bayt as people that are so good and out of reach. eventually people that don't believe in Ahl Bayt go that such a person can't exist because I feel like I can't reach that level. So people that don't believe in Ahl Bayt have this mentality that why would we believe in such people? They shouldn't exist because I can't reach that level. Their envy blinds them from following Ahl Bayt, from what they should be doing, blinds them from looking at guides because they think they themselves are better. And if they can't do something and someone else has it, that person shouldn't exist. No, they don't exist. So they get in that stage of denial. And so they isolate themselves from Ahl Bayt. They can't see their guides, and so they become lost. That's really what happens to people that don't follow the path of Ahl Bayt. And so, pretty much what happens is they can take one of two sort of like standpoints. The first one is they obviously just don't listen to them, full stop. They don't follow what Ahl Bayt are saying, and so they go astray. They don't follow the Sirat al-Mustaqim. Alternatively, some people can still have envy towards Ahl Bayt, but recognize their importance. And that's whereby they copy them out of context. So let's say they take a hadith, they take it out of context because they no longer look at Ahl Bayt. They recognize they're important, but they no longer look at their lives and try getting to understand them, and follow them exactly. So they take a hadith, they take it out of context, and they radicalize. They become people that do things that aren't what Ahl Bayt want, but they say it's for the name of Ahl Bayt, which theoretically actually ruins the face of Ahl Bayt and may make people that don't follow them less inclined to follow them. It's a negative thing. And so that all stems from envy. Envy makes us the enemies of these people, which is really a big problem. The best example of envy in the Quran is the story of Qabil and Habil, where Qabil, or Cain, was envious of his brother. So the story goes as follows. They were both tasked to give sacrifices to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Habil's sacrifice was, he tended to the animals, and his sacrifice was much better than Qabil's, who didn't really pay attention, didn't spend a lot of time nurturing the crops, and they weren't great when he came to present them. And so Habil's sacrifice was accepted, Qabil's wasn't. This made him jealous and envious of his brother, who actually had the characteristics, or like the right idea. He spent time, he actually worked for this, and eventually got the benefit and got the reward, which was the acceptance of his sacrifice. Envy reaches such a point that it makes us take extreme action, whereby he killed his brother. The first instance of murder in the history of humankind was Qabil. And so in the Quran, the ayah goes as follows in Surah 5, ayah 30. فَوَطَوَّعَتْ لَهُ نَفْسُهُ قَتْلَ أَخِيهِ فَقَتَلَهُ فَأَصْبَحَ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. The word we're going to highlight here is his self. His self permitted him, his ego permitted him to feel envious and make it reach a point of murder. So, when we see people, in Islam that say they're Muslim, but they don't follow everything. Let's say they don't wear hijab, for example. They put on makeup in public. That's wrong. That's not what Ahl Bayt taught us. But they sort of think that they know better than Ahl Bayt, because surely they themselves are better than Ahl Bayt. Because if Ahl Bayt were better than them, that doesn't make sense, like they're just that egotistical, and that envy blinds them. Or alternatively, people that, we see them protest issues that aren't worth their time. We see them, like, for example, just in general, people that protest things that aren't worth their time. They're putting their own values as things that are more important than Ahl Bayt's values. And why that's a problem for us specifically is if we have this envy, we're not going to be able to see the Imam Mahdi Adallah Ta'ala Faraj Sharif when he comes back. We won't be able to identify him. When he comes back, we're going to turn a blind eye. We're going to be like, that's not Imam Mahdi. And the people that are like going to follow him, we're going to tell them, no, that's not him. Surely that's not him. He's not going to come in my time. Stuff like that. All these things are stemming from envy, because we don't want to recognize that we have to follow someone who's better than us. So that's, the problem. And eventually we could be part of the people who are going to fight the Imam when he comes back. And that's what's really scary. So, taking this down from Ahl Bayt, we can even see it in our daily interactions with people. When there are people that are really good, people that, we are following our debates, are on that right track. A lot of the time we go, no, they're being extremist, or they're shismeh, or they're doing it just to, like, in front of people to show off. For example, if we walk into a masjid, we see someone reading Quran in a beautiful voice, or just reading Quran or praying, we go, oh, look, he's just doing that so people can think he's cool or good. That's not for me, you know, and you sort of like avoid that person like the plague. You're disgusted by them. That stems from your envy of them. Just because, like, you're having that su'lan, or like, that's the word we use in Arabic, or like that bad impression on people just because they're better than you. And that's not right. The Prophet peace be upon him says, احمل أخاك المؤمن على 70 محملا من الخير. Give your fellow brothers 70 excuses of good excuses before you think of them or make a judgment about them. But a lot of time our envy blinds us and we don't even give people a chance. Next up is greed. Greed, we said, was the antinomy of dhikr, and Scrooge McDuck really personifies that. Greed is our desire for worldly things, or being greedy, wanting it all for yourself. So things like money, fame, and even just self-importance. You can also greed, want that, or even influence in society. And why that's a problem is because it entrenches you in those roots that connect you to the dunya. You know how we said that death is severing those roots, and we want to die before we die? We want to sever those roots before it becomes really painful and hard for us to sever those attachments. And then in Barzakh we'll really suffer because we won't be ready to go to the hereafter. So greed is really what makes those roots strong and solidifies them. And that is the opposite of dhikr, because dhikr is thinking of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so thinking of the real future rather than thinking of the current future or the past. So greed really stems from, the problem with greed is giving ourselves ownership of something. When in reality, let's think about it. We don't own anything. Everything is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's. He's in Malik. So he owns everything. But us giving ourselves the self-importance, our ego giving us the importance that we own things, is the problem of greed. So remember when we talked about the example of the trampoline, we said our goal was, to reach the sky. But the problem is, having attachments to this ground obviously won't let you jump. It's like having ropes tied to the ground. You can't actually jump on the trampoline. But even if we cut all those, attachments, if we ourselves are too heavy, we won't be able to jump high. We're not talking about someone being fat, as in if your ego is literally like a thuqul, it's like a weight, and it weighs down on you, and it won't let you jump high at all. You won't be able to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or reach for the skies if you yourself haven't if you haven't ridden yourself from your heart, if you haven't gone this shirk. And therefore both your ego makes you more attached to the ground, and then will facilitate the roots to grasp you and for you to be more attached to the material world. Alright, so the example of greed that we're going to look at in the Quran is Qarun. And if you don't know who Qarun was, he was this guy, and he thought it was because of him that he was so rich and so good. He was part of Bani Israel, by the way, in the time of Prophet Musa. Prophet Musa was like, Qarun, dude, you're making yourself too important. You're being too egotistical, man. You're being too greedy, because he kept trying to hoard all the wealth. At the beginning, he was a good person who used to give it to the poor people, but then he thought it belonged to him, and he got that ownership, and that was his problem. Eventually, his adab, or his punishment, was that an earthquake, the ground broke apart, and his house fell on top of him. He died. It's as if it was a sinkhole. So in the Quran, in Surah 28, Ayah 78, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he's talking, this is what Qarun said, قَالَ إِنَّمَا أُوتِيتُهُ عَلَىٰ عِلْمٍ عِنْدِي. He said, it was me, I have the knowledge, and it's because of my knowledge that I have this accumulation of wealth. So here, we can see how the ego stemmed to his greed, and his attachment to the dunya. And so, pretty much the problem here is that we're attributing material things with our self-worth. That's the problem with greed. It attaches material stuff to who we are, or ourselves. And that's the biggest problem, because it means we're creating those attachments. When you're greedy, you want more material things because you want it for yourself. So things like money become important to you. Things that feed your self-worth. Things like experience, they also feed your self-worth. Things like, knowledge. You also start craving knowledge because you think it makes you more important. Followers, I want as many likes as possible. Also self-worth. And even hoarding toilet paper for your own self-worth and your own survival, people got to a point that they were so greedy, because they wanted it for their own survival, not thinking of people around them. And that's another problem with greed. It makes you blind to the people around you and sets up barriers, unnecessary barriers between you and others, even to people in your inner circle. It's really problematic. So that's why greed can stop us. So now let's link it to dhikr. Why does greed stop us from doing dhikr? It's because it makes us attached to the dunya and the fake future and not see the real future. And so that's why it's the antinomy of dhikr, because it makes us so attached to this dunya that we can't see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala everything. So the way to get over greed, just like we said, to get over pride, we have to get rid of our addictions. To get rid of envy, we have to not hate those people that do good, but try joining them, learning from them. And give our brothers 70 excuses. Here, it's to, as we said in dhikr, it's to start our day and end start everything we do and end everything we do in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's, to create that routine. It's important to have that routine, to force yourself to do that remembrance so that you get into that mindset and you avoid seeing everything as a material, in its material state. See the reality of everything. So before we eat, say Bismillah alhamdulillah. Before you sleep, Bismillah alhamdulillah. Before you drive, Bismillah alhamdulillah. Before anything you do, you have to have this dhikr. Make it a routine. Make it like something that you like make yourself accountable. Even say it out loud so that your family members can be like, I didn't hear you say it. Create that routine for yourself so you do have that remembrance. The last of the 4 things was hate. Hate's a problem because it really sets up a barrier between you and others. It creates that thing because you see yourself as... do you remember at the end of the Hanging Out with the Right Crowd lecture from last week, we said that a problem can be when people see their own self-organization as better and belittle others. They make themselves as really important. What that does is it shuts off people that you can be connected to that could be in your inner circle and could be your awliya and are super important. People that actually deserve to be your awliya can be blocked off because of your hatred towards them. So hatred really can be conscious and unconscious. So you can obviously consciously be like, I don't like you, I hate you, get out of my life. Because, you could be jealous, it could stem from envy, pride, etc., etc. But also, it can be an unconscious thing. Maybe yourself will make, you'll sort of, in yourself, you'll make yourself think that a person has bad characteristics, and therefore you hate them. But that's only because you delude yourself into thinking that. That's why it can be unconscious, your hatred put towards it. Sometimes we don't like something, we don't know why we don't like it. And it's because we have that intrinsic jealousy or intrinsic pride that we can't accept that person. That's where hatred can come into play. And that's why it can stop ourselves from hanging out with the right crowd. So it can be something that, our conscious hatred, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There could be all this unconscious hatred that we don't even know about. The unknown unknowns, the stuff that we just don't realize about ourselves, something that's so intrinsic in us. And so, we want to avoid it because it can block us from not only people outside our family, but even inside of our family. Just not giving people enough time can make them hate us and build that barrier between us and our children, for example. Alright. So hate, just in terms of psychology, it stems from fear, but also just disapproval. So a lot of the time we fear people that are, not like us. We want to be like everyone else. And so that's why we hate anything that's opposing us. It's an intrinsic sort of response to external stimulus, which is important for survival, but it's not important when dealing with other people. Disapproval is when you see someone and you don't like what they're doing, you sometimes just block them instantaneously, rather than maybe helping them to change, or even realizing that what they're doing is not bad and what your perception was wrong from the beginning. giving them the 70 excuses because we don't know why someone may be doing something. And so these two things can build hatred. So fear and disapproval themselves aren't bad things, by the way. Fear is important, as we said, for survival, and fearing consequences as well is important because it will make us remember the reality of our actions. Same thing with disapproval. Disapproving from our own actions and our own bad deeds is important so we can realize they're wrong. These are important parts of that anger, the constructive anger. So they're both good things, but it's having too much of them that can be problematic. It's the balance of how much of them we should have. And so the example in the Quran that we're going to take for hatred is Ashab al-Jannah. So their story was, they had this beautiful garden, then they saw themselves as too good. They didn't want poor people, taking part from their garden, getting the benefits. They hated people that weren't part of them. They built that barrier themselves. They actually, I'm pretty sure, I don't remember the story myself, exactly how they stopped the people, but I'm pretty sure they built a barrier between them and the others, so they couldn't reach their garden. I can't remember, it might have not been a physical barrier, but they just didn't let anyone enter their garden. And didn't want them to take, reap the benefits of the garden. Eventually what happened was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took it away from them. And they were regretful. The Quran says that they did pray for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it back to them because they regretted their actions. But in reality, it's because they had that hatred towards others that the ni'mah was taken from them, so the blessings were taken from them. The Quran in Surah Al-Qalam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَغَدَوْا عَلَىٰ حَلٍ قَادِرِينَ. And they went to their garden early in the morning in determination, assuming they were able to get away with their actions. They thought they were that good, they could get away with, hating others and creating those barriers. But the answer was they weren't. So, yeah, that whole notion that they themselves were able, قادرين, that's the problem. And so, صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
Sorry, now I forgot what that slide was. No, but I remember now. So what we're saying is, so if someone has a different opinion from you, or even just in general, you see someone as a separate entity from you, doesn't mean you have to block them off and hate them for it. Because a lot of sometimes we don't see the reality of what they're thinking. They might be more knowledgeable than us and see something that we can't. And so if we build that barrier, we can never understand and reach that level that they have reached. We never understand where they're coming from. And so sometimes when we're really confused about something, we shouldn't just instantly make a block and be like, our opinion's the best. We should really seek the people that have knowledge. People that, the ulama, because they'll have the best understanding. And instead of, hating ulama, which is a very bad thing. Some people do hate ulama, and they don't know what they're talking about. They're outdated and stuff like that. That comes from them not wanting to accept that they shouldn't have these barriers, and they should accept that other people are better than them, and they should learn from others. So having your fellow Muslims as awliya, so they can show you your faults. Being accepting of that. So welcoming outside input's important. So the Prophet actually says, again, we reiterate this point. It's really important. Alright, so now that we've talked about the 4 things, we have to sort of explore now why it's important. So we've sort of established why it's really important to kill the ego. And we've said that these steps that we need to take, not putting up these unnecessary barriers and unnecessary hatred, getting rid of addictions, not having that envy towards others, and accepting those people, but also just to have a routine of Bismillah, Alhamdulillah. All those things are really important to kill the ego. But why is it in itself important to kill the ego? So it's important to kill the ego so that we don't get entrenched in this dunya, and so that we can actualize our human soul. And there's a really nice dua that we'd like to impart with you guys. It's a segment from a dua, Makarim al-Akhlaq, which is by Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. Sajjad alayhi salam, sorry. And in this dua, it really shows us the way to kill our ego. The Imam says, وَعِزْنِي وَلَا تَبْتُلْنِي بِالْكَبْرِ, which is pride. وَعَبُّدْنِي وَلَا تُفْسِدْ عِبَادَتِي بِالْعُجُبِ. So don't ruin my worship with self-admiration. Because a lot of time, we have that intention that we're doing it because we think we're awesome and we think we're so good. But we have to remember that all this ni'am that we get, all these opportunities to get better are given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it goes on to all these, so I want you to read it in your own time, but it really does highlight key points, the different ways that we can kill our ego, and it all stems from putting ourselves down in our own eyes, lowering our own self-importance. That's the only way for us to be able to kill the ego and, give ourselves less space in our hearts. Alright, so now, why do we even bring this up? It's important, to understand why, how to avoid not actualizing our divine intellectual soul, how to avoid these barriers to those 4 steps. But in fact, we actually have to kill the ego before we even approach reaching the divine universal soul, which is next week's lecture. We can't even begin to have a close relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if we exist in the equation, as if we think we're so important to have a place in our heart with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that's why it's really important for us to kill the ego before we even reach this level. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. It's easier said than done, because in today's society, we have so many examples of self-love and, love yourself, believe in yourself, you're important, you're special. All these different characters have this notion whereby they, have the self-importance, you're special, you're important, you can drive your own decisions, your own life. And the problem, it's being presented in such a multitude that our children are being conflicted. They're actually believing they're so super important, not realizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is all important. They believe that they're the center of the universe, when they should realize that there are others around them who are just as important, if not more, like that debate. And so, really, the problem in society today is that because everyone's in this notion, we'd be standing out if we aren't ego-centered. We'd be standing out if we take decisions that aren't ego-based. And so, it can be assumed that if we don't follow our ego, we are walking against the stream, the mainstream. But you know what? That's not actually true. It's not that if we're against the mainstream. It's not like whatever society says we have to go against because society is ego-driven. Nor is it that we should follow the mainstream and follow society. A lot of people think that society and Islam, like Western society and Islam, are complete opposites and it's things that always clash and conflict. But that isn't true. We have to be able to live with both. Because Islam is a way of life. Society isn't a way of life. So if you take what society says as your way of life, that's when you know it's wrong. And that you are following the mainstream. At the same time, going completely against what society says is also wrong. Going against the laws of the country you're in is wrong. So you know what? We need to learn how to live with both. But Imam Ali says something that's really profound and something that we should really take into heart. Imam Ali says, لا تستوحشوا طريق الحق لقلة سالكيه. He says, don't shy away from the path of truth due to the little people who are on it or who take it. That's important because, our road to, suppressing our ego, we may feel like we're the only ones in it, or we're alone there, or there is little people there. But in reality, the path of good is only striven by little people compared to the majority. And so we shouldn't be afraid to take this. We should be comforted that the Imams tell us that this is the way. Like if we are feeling alone on this path, we should remember that means that possibly could mean we're on the right path. That's not to say in everything we should be alone, but in this particular instance, we should try striving against that mainstream per se. But not in everything. That's what we're trying to get at. So that was the take-home message for today, inshallah. It's to crush our ego. We need it so we can actualize our divine intellectual soul and even begin to look at the divine universal soul. And it's important for us to navigate in this society today because it's so ego-driven and we have to sort of navigate around that. Instead of just buying things for ourselves, think of others and things like that. So صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Today's clip by far is my favorite clip out of all the clips because it is so good. Like, as in, by that what I mean is it's like so related to today's lecture. Like, they even, you'll see what it is, but it's pretty much, the series is Del Toro Quest. And if you haven't seen the series, recommend it highly, or even read the books. Really good series. The writer is Christian. She had a lot of really good, like, religious concepts that we can draw from, intertwined in her story. It's for a younger age group, so it's, for teenagers. So even if you're older, I still do recommend it. Really good series. So just a bit of context about it. They are trying to collect 7 gems to defeat someone called the Shadow Lord, and he's the Shadow Lord will make him equate the Shaitan pretty much, and he's someone who's taken over the land, and he's separated the people into different factions. People became so driven by their own self-importance that they were driven apart, and then made them weaker, and so he was able to return. And so these gems, if united together, can unite the people, and so they'll be able to, stand a chance against the Shaitan or the Shadow Lord. So this is when our heroes are at the final gem. They're going to get the last of the 7 gems. Wow, the rain is very loud today. Anyway, so inshallah, today I'll show you guys the lecture, the clip, and we can get a lot out of it. So pretty much they're at the final guardian of the gem. So they're at the final guardian of the gem. The guardian is someone who protects the gem. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the gem from him so that it can finally complete the belt, which has all the gems on it, and unite the 7 tribes and the 7 kingdoms. Alright, let's watch the clip.
Standing where you are now, he told me that he and his cause, whatever that may be, wanted nothing that had been tainted by my possession. He left here cursing me with every step.
That sounds like doom, and it would explain why he didn't want us to come to the valley in the first place.
What about you? Will you collect your prize, or will you also run away in disgust, now that you know who I really am? You must decide.
Run away? We have no reason to run away. You promised us that if we won, we could take the diamond and leave.
Such confidence, my young friend. Be careful it doesn't blind you. Now then, pride, hate, envy, greed.
What's going on?
You lied to us.
No, I didn't. You may leave with the diamond. However, I'd like you to leave all the other gems behind. Or did you think I was unaware of that belt you carry with you? Attack!
It must be in there.
These things!
Their wounds seem to heal instantly.
I'm afraid that you will never be able to defeat my little pets. All of you are mine to keep forever.
Narita?
What are you doing?
Come on, help us! You're all mine. And soon you're going to make me very, very rich, aren't you? Not too bad for a day's work.
Narita!
They'll never let you leave!
Hate to break it to you, Varda, but it looks like you're the ones who are never gonna leave.
That double-crossing!
But why are you letting her take it when she didn't even play the game?
It's not up to me. You must realize the diamond is the symbol of purity and strength. Gained honorably, it is a source of great power, but obtained for greed alone, it only brings misery.
I see you bred the belt of Deltora too. If you knew that, weren't you afraid it would do the same to you?
I fear no such thing. The Shadow Lord granted me my powers to protect this valley and the diamond. I was chosen because I was not tempted by it. I'm immune to its powers, for I am its guardian.
You're not immune, you're a fool. The diamond's curse is already on you.
Come on, he's right. Don't you realize? Living alone in this valley surrounded by the living dead is your punishment?
It's a lie. I live in this palace as a king. Wake up, old man.
Don't you say you're being used by the Shadow Lord?
No, you've got it all wrong. It is I who am using him. A bit unfair, I admit, but I will not tolerate insolence. So stop wasting my time and give me the belt.
I won't do it.
I will put it to good use, boy, I assure you.
Leave it alone.
The lapis lazuli, the heavenly stone, a powerful talisman that breaks all manner of spells.
Stay back! I can't control them! Please, you've got to help me!
Barda, let's cut the cords.
There it is!
They weren't his pets. They were part of him, like vile growths coming out of his body. Over the years, his hate, greed, envy, and pride became demons that eventually turned into living flesh.
The diamond.
صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Okay, first thing to note was the names of the four creatures were pride, hate, envy, and greed. How perfect, like, and then what the older good guy said at the end. He said that his pride, hate, and envy and greed had become so large they manifested in a physical form. We can take that as we're not talking about it manifesting in a physical form, but it's showing the reality of these four in the hereafter. You know how we said that our actions have a reality in the hereafter, like in our hereafter form, and they can make us look different? What these four characteristics of the ego and having a large ego can do is they can make us have, say, ugly form in the hereafter, even inhuman. Like you saw the person himself, he may have looked human on the outside, but in reality you saw he was connected to these four growths that came out of him, things that weren't human, weren't things that were nice. So that was one thing. Secondly, the amount of times he used the word I in his things. He said, I was chosen, I was Madrishinu, to the point that he said, the shaitan is not using me, I am using him. His arrogance reached such a point that he thought he was better than the shaitan at deluding himself. Like, it's crazy. But it shows how much one person's ego can spiral out of control if you let it grow. And how the more he talked, remember how the bigger those things got? The pride, hate, envy, and greed. It shows how our ego is the starting point, and it feeds and makes those other bad characteristics grow. The larger our ego, the stronger those things become, and eventually they can become out of control because and lead us to complete downfall, because that's what they do pretty much in this dunya. It'll mean that we failed the test and we're going to get punished for it. So that's one thing. Another point, I'm sorry, I didn't to explain about that girl that comes in the middle of the thing. They know her from previously, she's pretty much a thief. And so she steals the diamond and gets away with it. She knows these people, she chooses not to help them because her greed blinded her from helping others. So eventually it became a barrier for her to see other people. So that was another thing that was there. Yeah, so pretty much the main things I wanted you guys to get out from was take the guy as like, let's say that person, the figure, as the ego, and the 4 things were like his characteristics: the pride, the hate, the envy, the greed, and how they feed off the ego, and how the bigger the ego, the bigger they can get, and that they can, they manifest in a vile form in the hereafter. I think that's it for today. So, صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Thanks for tuning in.